اور کلین انرجی کی جانب سے تمام ساتھیوں کو خوش آمدید. ہماری آج کا جو پینل ہے اس کا مقصد یہ ہے کہ گیس کا جو تیزی سے بڑھتا بحران ہے پاکستان میں، اس کے حوالے سے ایک اکثر نگلیکٹڈ پہلو ہے، نظر انداز شدہ ایک پہلو ہے جو کہ سامنے نہیں رکھا جاتا، وہ ہے بگ فائنانس کا کردار اس کے پیچھے اور اس میں جو اس کا رول رہا ہے ہسٹوریکلی اور ریسنٹلی. تو اس حوالے سے آج کا جو پینل ہے وہ ہم نے ارینج کیا ہے. مقصد بنیادی یہ ہے کہ ایک ریکارڈس کی ایک اسٹڈی حال میں پبلش ہوئی ہے اور یہ تحقیق ہے ورلڈ بینک کا کردار جو رہا ہے گیس کو سپورٹ کرنے میں اور اس کو پذیرائی دینے میں، جس کے نتائج جو ہیں وہ ہمارے سامنے آج مرتب ہو رہے ہیں. اس وقت جیسے کہ آپ ساروں کو معلوم ہوگا، گیس کے حوالے سے ایک بہت بڑا بحران جو ہے وہ جاری ہے، جس میں انرجی سیکٹر، انڈسٹریل سیکٹر، ڈومیسٹک سیکٹر ساروں پہ جو ہے وہ اس کے منفی اثرات مرتب ہو رہے ہیں. اس کے علاوہ جو سامنے ایک تحقیق کی وجہ سے سامنے پچھلے سالوں میں جو دیکھنے کو ملا ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ گیس کو ایک کلین انرجی قطعاً شمار نہیں کیا جا سکتا. اس کے جو ماحولیات کے حوالے سے اور مقامی لوگوں کی زندگیوں کے حوالے سے جو منفی اثرات ہیں وہ اب خاصی اچھی طرح سے جو ہیں وہ جانے جاتے ہیں عالمی سطح پہ. تو میں آپ کی آج کے کچھ گراؤنڈ رولز ہیں وہ میں بتا دیتا ہوں ہمارے لاجسٹکس کے حوالے سے. پہلے تو یہ کہ ہمارا پروگرام جو ہے وہ 3 سپیکرز ہیں ان کی پریزنٹیشن سے مشتمل ہوگا. اس کے بعد 15 منٹ کا ایک اوپن سوال ہے جو آپ کا سیشن ہوگا. آپ پریزنٹیشنز کے دوران یا بعد میں چیٹ باکس میں اپنے سوال جو ہے وہ پوسٹ کر سکتے ہیں اور ہمارے اسپیکر جو ہے ان کا جواب دے دیں گے جب سوال جواب کا سیشن شروع ہوگا. اس کے علاوہ جو ہاتھ اٹھانے کا ایک زوم میں جو ہے آپشن وہ بھی استعمال کر سکتے ہیں کوشچن آنسرز کے سیشن میں براہ راست پینلسٹ سے بھی سوال کیا جا سکتا ہے. اب میں پینل کے تعارف کی طرف جاؤں گا. ہمارے مرکزی جو اسپیکر ہیں، ہماری مرکزی اسپیکر وہ فرین وٹ ہیں. فرین جو ہے انہوں نے یہ تحقیق جو ہے وہ بھی پبلش کی ہے، دا ٹربل ود گیس ان پاکستان، ہاؤ ورلڈ بینک گروپ سپورٹ فار فاسل گیس ہیز امپیڈڈ دا رینیوبل انرجی ٹرانزیشن. فرین جو ہیں وہ کیمپینز لیڈ ہیں، ایک نیدرلینڈز میں بیسڈ ادارہ ہے ریکورس. ادھر ریکورس جو ہے وہ ڈیولپمنٹ فائنانس پر تحقیق کرتا ہے اور بہتر ماحولیاتی نتائج کو یقینی بنانے کے لیے سرمایہ کاری کا جو بہاؤ ہے اس کو ہدف بناتا ہے تاکہ ایک جامع ماحولیاتی طور پر پائیدار اور سماجی طور پہ منصفانہ ترقی کی راہیں کھل سکیں. اس کے علاوہ ان کا غریبوں کی ترقی کو یقینی بنانے کا اور اس کا جو ماحولیات سے تعلق ہے اس پہ بھی ایک گہری نظر ہے. برائن کے پاس تقریباً 30 سال سے زیادہ تجربہ ہے جس میں ماحولیاتی انصاف، اقتصادی انصاف، ترقیاتی مالیات اور بین الاقوامی سطح پہ انسانی حقوق پر ان کا فوکس رہا ہے. فرین کے علاوہ ہمارے پاس آج 2 ڈسکسنٹس بھی ہیں جو ماہرین ہیں، ایک انرجی فائنانس اینالسٹ ہیں اور ایک ہمارے انوائرمنٹل لائر ہیں ہمارے ساتھ. ہنیہ اسعد جو ہیں وہ انرجی فائنانس اینالسٹ کے طور پہ کام کرتی ہیں انسٹیٹیوٹ فار انرجی اکنامکس اور فائنینشیل انالیسس یعنی آئیفا میں. وہ خود ایک آتھر ابھی حال میں انہوں نے بھی ایک پبلش کی ایک اسٹڈی پاکستان کے گیس کا جو سیکٹر ہے اس میں جو مسائل ہیں اور اس کا خاص طور پہ شارٹ ٹرم اور لانگ ٹرم انرجی سیکیورٹی کے حوالے سے. ہنیہ جو ہے وہ ایشیا میں جو انرجی مارکیٹس ہیں ان کو کور کرتی ہیں، خاص طور پہ ان کا جو فوکس ہے وہ ساؤتھ ایسٹ ایشیا پہ اور پاکستان پہ. ہنیہ جو ہے وہ ڈسکس کریں گی آج کے جو گیس کے اصل یعنی ٹرو کاسٹ جو ہے اس کی وہ کیا رہی ہے پاکستان کے لیے، اور آگے جو پاکستان کی انرجی نیڈز ہیں ان کے لیے کون سے بہتر جو ہیں ذرائع اس وقت مل سکتا ہے ہمیں گیس کے علاوہ. اسی کے ساتھ ساتھ ہمارے ساتھ عبد الرافع بھی ہیں. عبد الرافع ایک وکیل ہیں، خاص طور پہ انوائرمنٹل لاء سے ان کا تعلق ہے اور ایسوسیٹ بھی ہیں آلٹرنیٹیو لاء کلیکٹیو لاہور میں. ان کی اپنی جو مہارت ہے وہ انوائرمنٹل لاء اور پالیسی کے حوالے سے، اور انہوں نے گراؤنڈ ریسرچ بھی کافی کی ہوئی ہے LNG امپورٹ انفراسٹرکچر. یہ LNG امپورٹ انفراسٹرکچر ہے، یہ ہمارے کراچی کے کوسٹل ایریاز وغیرہ میں جو ہے پائے جاتے ہیں اور ان کے کافی منفی اثرات جو ہیں انوائرمنٹل اور سوشل پوائنٹ آف ویو سے ان پہ جو ہے وہ رافع کی گہری نظر ہے. وہ ہمارا اس وقت جو ہے ہمارے تھرڈ ڈسکشن کے طور پہ ہمیں جوائن کریں گے. تو کسی تاخیر کے بغیر میں شروع کرتا ہوں. میں فرین کو دعوت دوں گا. فرین پلیز ٹیک اٹ اوور.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for giving me the opportunity to present the findings of our report to you today. I really appreciate having this chance to speak to the wider community, and also very keen to get your feedback. And also it's an enormous honor for me to be on a platform together with Hania and also with Rafe, who I think have very complementary findings in the research that they've done, both at a community level in relation to the impact on the mangroves, but also on the LNG market in general and the impact that that has on Pakistan. So I'm really, really looking forward to an interesting discussion. I've got a few slides just to help share the information that we found in the report. And I should say that the findings that we have here are a joint effort by Recourse together with Zain, who's just introduced us, as well as with Hussein Jawar from ACJCE. So this is a shared publication, and we used it to lobby at the World Bank meetings in the spring, but we will continue to use it to influence going forwards. So these are 3 studies that we worked on earlier this year, and one of them is the trouble with gas in Pakistan. But we also developed 2 others, one with partners in Indonesia and another with partners in Bangladesh. And although there are differences and they vary slightly in terms of the content and emphasis, basically the findings are the same. That the World Bank Group's finance for fossil gas is a triple disaster of crippling energy prices, climate change, and environmental damage. And those are the findings across all of those 3 reports. So just as a reminder, why is fossil gas harmful? We may all know the answer to this, but just to reflect a little bit. So the main problem with gas is that it significantly leaks methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, from processing, transport, regasification, and consumption. And it is significantly more stronger than carbon dioxide over 20 years, and is very it's a very important greenhouse gas, so significant contributor to climate change. It also, although it's invisible, it affects air quality, and hazardous air pollutants have very harmful effects on human health and on the environment. And leaks from pipelines also are full of chemicals that get into the environment and into water supplies. And I think that Rafe may have more to say about that later on. And finally, the continued support for gas, including LNG, which is the highly frozen version of gas, which is now currently routinely imported by countries, is not only locking countries into high carbon and polluting energy model, but it's draining investments away from the renewable energy transformation. So the money that should be being invested in renewable energy is still and increasingly going towards gas. So you may have heard that the World Bank committed to stop financing gas, and to some extent they did. So in 2017, the World Bank Group announced that it would no longer finance upstream oil and gas projects. So this includes things like exploration, drilling, and extraction, and that was to start in 2019. But it didn't rule out support for midstream, which is transportation and pipelines, or downstream gas, such as refining and distribution. So it's a really massive gap in the World Bank's commitment. And although they've committed to rule out coal, as we'll see a bit later, that hasn't happened across the board either. So in Global Energy Monitor's recent study, they found that a staggering $22.4 billion of public finance went to fossil gas projects in Asia between 2014 and 2018. So absolutely massive amount of money in public investment in fossil gas, which should have been going towards the renewable energy transformation. So I stole a quote from Zane, and he said the following: "The World Bank must recognize that their previous policy of supporting fossil gas and LNG infrastructure has been a costly mistake that has contributed to Pakistan's reliance on imported LNG today and the exorbitant spot prices of suppliers." So thank you for that, Zane. It's very cogent and clear. So how has the World Bank and IFC supported LNG? So the World Bank and its private sector arm, the IFC, have specifically sought to expand the use of imported liquefied natural gas, which has created a dependency on it, and which is not only crippling environmentally and socially, but has also become an economic burden in many countries, including Pakistan. Global LNG prices have surged to record highs. And in the winter of 2021, fuel costs from gas were 3 times higher than from energy generated from solar and wind. So back in 2015, importing gas was considered an economically viable source of power generation. It was cheap. It was easily accessible at that time. But obviously the picture has changed, and there's no immediate end in sight to that picture. And today, as experienced in Pakistan, LNG suppliers are defaulting on deliveries, and countries are having to turn back to using diesel as a main source of energy. And that's extremely climate damaging and polluting as well. So if this money had been put in to developing sustainable, renewable, indigenous sources of energy, we would have been in a position today where Pakistan could have had more energy security, would have been able to rely on its own renewable sources, which haven't been sufficiently invested in. So how did the IFC support LNG in Pakistan? And I think this is really important to realize. So in 2015, the IFC mobilized $64.5 million to support Engro, which is a leading Pakistani conglomerate, to support the very first liquefied natural gas terminal in Pakistan. And I think it's really critical because obviously at that time, gas was very cheap. But I think that this initial investment has been what has catalyzed the massive increase in the use of LNG in Pakistan. And from my most recent reading, Pakistan is now highly dependent on LNG, and 25% of the energy comes from gas. And today, there are new investments in gas and gas infrastructure, which are catalyzed by the World Bank's initial investments back in 2015. So there are at least 2 new floating storage gas regasification units planned in Port Qasim, as well as 1 combined cycle gas turbine. And this infrastructure has a life cycle of 30 years. So if Pakistan is going to meet its objectives under the Paris Agreement and its nationally determined contributions, it's going to struggle with new infrastructure like this coming online. So I've put here that the terminal handles up to 4.5 million tons of fossil gas every year, but I believe that figure has increased. So as I've said, I think Pakistan has now become highly dependent on imported LNG, and it's put its energy security at risk. So just coming back to the World Bank and where the problem lies. So the nub of the problem is with the Climate Change Action Plan. So within the Climate Change Action Plan of the World Bank, it frames gas as a means to drive a just transition. So it says that in specific cases, natural gas may be useful in accelerating the transition away from coal. A gas power plant may be essential to enhance power reliability and grid stability, and thus facilitate rates of renewable integration. Now, this little paragraph here, and there's a couple of others in the Climate Change Action Plan, it's just being used as a massive excuse to accelerate investment in gas. And it's almost, at the moment, I think there's an exponential increase in investment in gas, both through public and private finance. But even within the Climate Change Action Plan, they recognise that new gas infrastructure is not always consistent with the need to decarbonise economies. So they've kind of recognised that, but they're not really doing anything about that. So, so the Climate Change Action Plan is a fundamental problem, but there's other areas where gas appears, and as in Pakistan, there is references to the use of gas and accelerating gas within the country partnership framework, which is the main World Bank country strategy, and also within the systematic country diagnostic, which is the kind of research that is done to inform the strategy. I think a significant problem is the use of technical assistance by the World Bank to fund things like the gas sector strategies, the energy sector programs. All of these focus on gas to power or introducing competition in gas markets. So even though technical assistance may not be a huge amount of money, it underpins future policy, and in that sense is very problematic. And in relation to development policy finance, this is something that we've been working on together with ACJC recently, because it's been a significant problem. And I think most of you will be aware of the PACE development policy loan, that although it was developed to try to enhance the transition to renewable energy, in fact, one of the conditions or prior actions of the development policy finance was to fast track this development policy finance, and it meant that there wasn't time to sufficiently get agreement from the provinces in Pakistan to what was needed, and it led to the reduction of the renewable energy targets, which were between 30 and 33%, and it was reduced down to 17%. And within the energy program, there was a significant increased use of gas as well as increased use of coal. And that was partly as a result of that negotiation with the World Bank around the development policy finance. And there's another area which you're familiar with as well, which is that the IFC supports financial intermediaries, and they continue to support gas as well as coal. It's more difficult to trace where finance through financial intermediaries goes to, but it's not impossible, and it's something that we're also trying to track. So I think this is the key point, really. The concept of a transition to renewable energy is today being used by the World Bank and IFC as an excuse to continue to finance gas expansion. So the word transition has now become, it seems to now mean gas, rather than supporting countries to leapfrog from coal and dirty energy to sustainable renewable alternatives. Today, the word transition is suggesting that we must make a stepping stone through the gas phase of development rather than helping countries to move straight towards renewables. One of the excuses for this is that gas is needed to provide a base load for renewable energy. But in fact, today, battery storage systems are so much improved that they can pretty much cater for that problem. This approach is not only locking Pakistan and other countries into gas-based energy models, but it also may lead to stranded assets for decades to come and sapping badly needed investment away from truly sustainable alternatives. And it's also leading countries to dependency on LNG, it's now subject to skyrocketing prices and a lack of secure delivery, which is leading to energy poverty. So on this slide, I've just given a couple of examples of how the IFC is continuing to support coal through financial intermediary lending. And these two examples are in Indonesia and in the Philippines. But essentially, through financial intermediary lending, there's still significant support for coal. And I know that in Pakistan, you've already witnessed this through the development of the tar coal projects that have been supported through Habib Bank. But just to say, this is still going on. And if you look at the example for Java 9 and 10 in Indonesia, they are talking about supporting 52 huge coal-fired power stations, and which will release the same annual emissions as Thailand or Spain. And it's a similar story in the Philippines. So it's important to be watchful of that type of thing that's going on, and we need to try and counter anything that comes up along those lines in Pakistan as well. So just to remind us what the experts are saying. So the International Energy Agency report from 2021 specifically said that to meet net zero, beyond projects already committed as of 2021, there are no new oil and gas fields approved for development in our pathway, and no new coal mines or mine extensions are required. So this was the statement made by the International Energy Agency. There's no more room for new gas. That's basically pretty clear. And the Secretary General of the UN was very much of the same mind. Addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction. We need to fix the broken global economy mix. Instead of hitting the brakes on the decarbonisation of the global economy, now is the time to race towards a renewable energy future. So there are people making these statements, but the policy and the practice is very different. So these were our shared recommendations from the report that we wrote together for Pakistan. So that the World Bank should recognise that their previous policy of supporting fossil gas and LNG infrastructure has been a costly mistake that has contributed to the country's reliance on imported LNG today and the exorbitant spot prices of suppliers. That it should use its resources to support the government to transition rapidly away from fossil gas and imported LNG, with an emphasis on ensuring long-term energy security based on sustainable renewables and storage, as well as grid flexibility and upgrades. And that they should continue to support the transition to sustainable renewables, especially solar and wind, and promote the country's potential to leapfrog from coal to sustainable renewable energy. And finally, that there must be a full commitment to tackle the climate crisis and phasing out fossil fuels, including fossil gas, And this has to be a priority if the World Bank Group is going to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I'll stop there. I mean, there's an awful lot more to say, but I'd love to have the opportunity to have some questions and answers and to hear from the other speakers. But thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Fran, for that very important research. इसी के साथ मैं अब हनिया को दाव देता हूं कि वो आएं और डिस्कस करें एलएनजी के खास तौर पे जो इस वक्त प्राइसेस के जो सूरत हाल है इंटरनेशनल मार्केट में भी और इंपोर्ट के हवाले से भी. हनिया, ओवर टू यू.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much, Zain, and thank you, Fran, for that presentation. I think it's really eye-opening to see how MDBs and multilateral lending institutions have contributed towards this unsustainable lock-in of imported fossil fuels in Pakistan. I'm going to be mainly focusing on how closely linked energy and economic security are in Pakistan. So it won't be an overstatement to say that Pakistan is a natural gas-based economy. Jab se natural gas was discovered in Pakistan in the 80s, almost 50% of Pakistan's primary energy has come from natural gas. This has been in the form of industrial usage, cement production, fertilizer production, household usage. The residential sector is actually the largest consumer of natural gas within the country. And then of course power generation. Firstly, it used to be natural gas, and now it has shifted towards imported LNG. So a lot of our, a lot of the crucial sectors of our economy, they're based on natural gas usage, and even at present, about 43% of Pakistan's primary energy comes from natural gas. But we can see that Pakistan's domestic reserves are declining. They, according to some estimates, we have only about 13 years of supply left from our domestic reserves. And to fill the gap, and in parallel, we can see that our demand that is increasing along with the decline in these reserves. So to sort of plug that gap left by these declining reserves, more LNG is being pumped into the system, more imported LNG is being used to fulfill that gap. And this has led to Pakistan becoming more and more energy secure, especially at present, because firstly, LNG is unreliable at present, and then it is also very expensive. And as Fran said earlier in her presentation, it isn't a clean source of power generation. It is a fossil fuel, of course. So even, it is a fossil fuel, of course, so it leads to carbon dioxide emissions from its burning. And other than that, it is a potent greenhouse gas in itself. Natural gas is methane. And as Fran said, over a 20-year basis, it is even more harmful than carbon dioxide. So talking about the first point, why LNG is expensive and why is that important for Pakistan? Why has that been detrimental to Pakistan's economy? So if we look at the numbers, we can see that LNG has been up to almost 8 times more expensive than domestically produced gas. So अगर हम domestic gas की cost of production देखें, so that ranges within $3.5 to $4 per MMBTU. And in comparison, the LNG that has been procured over the spot market, that has been, some of these cargoes have cost up to $32 per MMBTU, usually upwards of $25 per MMBTU. So we can see almost 8 times more expensive. And even the long-term contracts, because they're linked to oil prices, they have yielded very high LNG prices, usually $6 to $8 per MMBTU. Gas में पड़ रही होती थी. It is now costing us around $10 to $12 per MMBTU through long-term procurement, long-term energy contracts. And this has resulted in an average cost of LNG in Pakistan of being $16 per MMBTU. So we can see an increase of 4 to 8 times more expensive than domestically produced gas. And and because power sector is such a major user of imported LNG, it is the biggest consumer of imported LNG at present. This directly impacts the cost of living in Pakistan, the cost of power generation, which translates to cost of production in industries, cost of production within the commercial sector, then gas usage in the household sector. So all the sectors of economy are linked to energy prices. And when we have such expensive power generation, it is of course going to have repercussions on all these dependent sectors within the economy. So just talking about the power sector, when power sector ki baat kare, because LNG is being used to produce power in the country, जो हमारे 3 major LNG के power plants हैं, they're a major source of power generation in the country. तो अगर उन्हीं को हम देखें, if let's say अगर हम procure करते हैं LNG at $25 per MMBTU, that is going to translate to power, to fuel prices for power generation of about $0.3, 30 cents per kilowatt hour, 30 cents per kilowatt hour, or 30 cents को अगर हम convert करें in PKR, that comes out to be about 60 rupees per kilowatt hour. That's just the fuel price. It's so expensive. Or अगर इसको हम average cost of electricity in the country से compare करें, so the cost of electricity in the country that used to be about 15 rupees and it has now risen to about 25 rupees per kilowatt hour. So we can see that this is already happening. Energy and electricity prices are on the rise in the country. Sorry. And then coming on to my second point, that LNG is becoming increasingly unreliable as a source of fuel. And why do I say this? And as we saw in Fran's presentation as well, she mentioned that some of these LNG supply companies, these have been defaulting on their supply agreements to Pakistan. And this is because Pakistan is a huge reliance on the spot market. Out of the total natural gas that is consumed in the country, takriban 26% is LNG. And जो LNG के routes of supply हैं, they are either through long-term energy contracts, energy purchase contracts, or through the spot market. And spot market accounts for about 44% of the LNG procurement in the country. So there's a huge reliance on the spot market and the global markets for LNG supply. And we can see that because of the Russia-Ukraine war, there's been a lot of uncertainty in the supply channels. Just give it say not only have the prices gone up, but supply has also become very unreliable. We've seen suppliers defaulting. The 2 major suppliers, Eni and Gunvor, they've defaulted at least 12 times over the last 10 months in Pakistan. And then sometimes, the fuel is just so expensive that Pakistan is unable to award any tenders or, get supplies. And this again translates into, harm for the economy, because there's a lot of important sectors of the economy that are dependent on this fuel, this imported fuel. So if we're talking about the industrial sector, let's take the example of the textile sector. In the textile sector, especially for industries that are located in Punjab, they're highly dependent on imported LNG. Industries in Sindh are using domestic gas, but industries in Punjab, they're using imported LNG. And in the textile sector, there are various applications where natural gas or LNG is used. So for power generation, and then for the production process itself, where gas is used as a heat source. So, if we just focus on the power production, most of these industries, most of the textile sector, that is, they produce their own power through imported LNG. And that translates into about 30 to 40% of the production costs. So these 40% of production costs, and they're dependent on an imported fuel, जिसकी supply is unreliable. So when there are supply crunches in the market, जब LNG की supply secure नहीं होती, supply is cut off to these industries. We saw in December 2021 that supply was cut off for about 15 days to the textile sector in Punjab, which resulted in a loss of about 20% of the annual revenue for the sector. So that's a huge amount, about $250 million was lost. And in addition to this, high cost of production, we can say 30 to 40% of the production costs are dependent on the cost of power generation or on the cost of gas indirectly. So when these costs rise, there's going to be a direct impact on the cost of the commodity itself. Any textile exports key price is going to rise. And Pakistan is in regional competition when it comes to the textile sector with other competing countries like India, China, and Bangladesh. So Pakistan has to, Pakistan really needs its energy to be cheap so that these products can be regionally competitive. And जब production costs इतनी ज़्यादा होती है, तो it hurts the regional competitiveness of these products. And not only that, the margins for profit also decreases for this sector. So just looking at the textile sector alone, देख सकते हैं कि how closely linked these energy prices, this uncertainty in LNG supply is to to the economy of the country. And so we've clearly seen how important it is to de-link the economy from such a huge reliance on imported fossil fuels such as LNG, and there are alternative available in the form of renewables. If we just do an apples to apples comparison for the cost of production, जहाँ हम देख रहे हैं a fuel cost of about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for imported LNG. अगर हम cost of power production देखें from renewables, it's just 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's really cheap to produce through renewables. And as Fran said, and some of us may already know, battery storage, and then smart planning can really help the integration of renewables into the grid. So there are ways around the intermittency related challenges of renewable energy. If we implement smart planning, we can really integrate more renewables into the grid, which will reduce our dependency on this imported fuel. And then for the industrial sector and other sectors of the economy which are dependent on LNG, there are other alternates available, but that is sort of more of a long-term approach. Massive R&D will be needed, and massive investment is going to be needed for these alternates to be adopted widely in the country. Just naming a few, there's biogas, there's green hydrogen, and then smart planning in the short term can also help relieve these supply crunches that we're currently facing due to global market volatility for LNG. So I'm going to stop over here, and then I'm I'll stick around to answer any questions that the audience might have. So thank you all for listening. Over to you, Zain.
थैंक यू अनिया, बहुत शुक्रिया. अब मैं राफे को दावत दूंगा. राफे, जो LNG के इंपोर्ट के हवाले से हानिया ने एक तफसीली एक हमें पिक्चर दी है, खास तौर पे उनके कॉस्ट के हवाले से. राफे, आप अगर उसकी माहौलियाती जो मामले हैं उसके रिलेटेड और इसके साथ साथ जो मकामी लोगों के मसाइल हैं उनको ज़रा सामने रखिए. शुक्रिया.
राफे, आपको अनम्यूट कर दिया गया, काइंडली आप भी
जी जी, बहुत शुक्रिया. आवाज़ आ रही है?
जी जी, क्लियर है
जी, बहुत शुक्रिया. अच्छा जी, आप लोगों ने अभी चंद मसाइल जिनका फ्रेंड ने जो है वो अपनी प्रेजेंटेशन में इहाता किया है और मिस हनिया ने भी, जिससे हमें मालूम हुआ कि गैस के या LNG का कोई भी अगर हम नया इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बनाएंगे तो वो इटसेल्फ एक डिज़ास्ट्रस जो है वो एक्शन होगा और अमल होगा, क्योंकि पेरिस एग्रीमेंट और फिर उनके लाइफ साइकिल्स और उनकी जो भी ड्यूरेशन होगी तो उसके तबाहकुन असरात जो है वो हमारी मौसमी मुल्क की क्लाइमेट के हवाले से भी होंगे और दीगर इकोनॉमी के भी बहुत ज़्यादा मसाइल होंगे. दूसरा, हमने ये भी जान लिया कि गैस जो है वो एक क्लीन फ्यूल नहीं है, बल्कि इसके अंदर बहुत ज़्यादा ऐसे कंपोनेंट और अनासिर पाए जाते हैं जो कि माहौल दुश्मन है, जिसमें मीथेन भी है. और दुनिया के अंदर जो बाकी गैस जहाँ से निकाली जाती है तो कुछ के अंदर रेडिएशन जैसे जहरीले केमिकल्स वगैरह भी पाए जाते हैं. तो इसी को बढ़ाते हुए मैं अपने मुल्क में इसके जो मसाइल पैदा हो रहे हैं कम्युनिटीज़ में और माहौल के हवाले से, तो उस पे हम जो है वो थोड़ी सी नज़र डाल लेते हैं. अच्छा, इसी मैथीन को लेते हुए सबसे पहली बात जो ज़हन में रखनी चाहिए वो ये है कि हमें वैसे तो मालूम है कि हमारे मुल्क में गैस का एक वसी और अरीज़ नेटवर्क जो है वो मौजूद है, और इस हवाले से हम कंपनियों के नाम भी जानते हैं जो कि गैस को मुल्क के तूल और अर्ज़ के अंदर जो प्रोवाइड करते हैं, जिसके अंदर SNGPL भी है और SSGPL भी है. तो मसला ये हो रहा है कि गैस का ये जो बड़ा एक पाइपलाइन का स्ट्रक्चर हमारे यहाँ मौजूद है, इसकी कारकर्दगी के ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा सवाल हैं, क्योंकि हर साल गैस का एक बड़ा हिस्सा जो है वो ज़ाया कर दिया जाता है और जो हिस्सा ज़ाया होता है वो ज़ाहिरी बात है मीथेन बन के फ़िज़ा के अंदर ही चला जाता है. तकरीबन 12 से 15% या 10% हिस्सा जो है वो तकरीबन ज़ाया होता है. तो आप अंदाज़ा लगा लें कि इसका हमारे माहौल पे क्या असर पड़ेगा. दूसरा ये है कि माहिरीन का ये कहना है कि गैस को डिस्कवर करने, गैस को जो है वो रिफाइन करने और फिर गैस की डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन, खा वो वेल हेड से हो या जनाब दूसरे मुल्क से LNG का जो भी एक प्रोसेस है, वो भी एक बड़ा माहौल दुश्मन है, क्योंकि तकरीबन 2% हिस्सा जो है वो गैस का जो भी आप इंपोर्ट करते हैं या डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन नेटवर्क के अंदर डालते हैं वो तकरीबन मीथेन की नज़र हो जाता है. तो वो भी, तो माहिरीन का ये कहना है कि ये इसे कोयले से भी ज़्यादा जो है वो माहौल दुश्मन बना देता है. अब इसमें एक अफसोसनाक बात यह है कि मीथेन को कंट्रोल करना या मीथेन को मॉनिटर करना या इस हवाले से कोई मिटिगेटरी मेजर्स लेना, इस हवाले से हमारे मुल्क में अभी तक कोई लेजिस्लेशन नहीं है. और जो माहौलियाती इदारे हैं, चाहे वो अभी तो ये सूबाई मौजू बन गया है जब से 18th अमेंडमेंट हुई है, ना फेडरल लेवल पे और ना प्रोविंस के लेवल पे ऐसा कोई सिस्टम अभी तक नहीं बनाया गया. तीसरी बात यह है कि चूँकि अब LNG टर्मिनल्स की बात हो रही है, क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ गैस के ज़खायर जो है वो तकरीबन ख़त्म होते जा रहे हैं, तो इस हवाले से जो टर्मिनल्स लगाए गए हैं वो समंदर के ऑफशोर टर्मिनल्स हैं, ज़मीन की बजाय समंदर पे. तो इस हवाले से पोर्ट कासिम ने जो जगह मुख्तस की है या जो जोन बनाया है, उसे LNG जोन कहते हैं. तो उस जोन में वैसे तो पहले से ही 2 टर्मिनल्स बनाए जा चुके हैं और एक और टर्मिनल लगाने की तैयारियां तकरीबन मुकम्मल हैं, और इस नए आने वाले टर्मिनल का नाम ताबीर LNG टर्मिनल है. तो ये जोन एक ऐसी जगह पर है जहाँ पर वहाँ के जो मकामी लोग हैं, यानी कराची के अंदर बहुत सारी बस्तियां हैं, मछेरे हैं, इब्राहिम हैदरी है, लट बस्ती है और दीगर कई कोर्ट्स हैं. यहाँ के लोग कई सदियों से इसी जोन के इर्द गिर्द या इसी जोन में अपनी रोजी रोटी कमाते थे मछलियों को शिकार करके. तो जब से यहाँ पर एक डेवलपमेंट का जाल बिछाया गया है और जब से ये LNG टर्मिनल्स वगैरह लगाए गए हैं, तो इन लोगों की रोजी रोटी खतरे में पड़ गई है, کیونکہ ان کو یہاں پر نہیں آنے دیا جاتا، پورا ایک سیکیورٹی زون میں تبدیل ہو گیا ہے. تو اور انہیں یہ کہا جاتا ہے کہ جناب آپ کھلے سمندر میں جا کے کریں، وہاں سے مچھلیاں آپ کو زیادہ ملیں. مگر مسئلہ یہ ہے کہ کھلے سمندر میں جائیں گے تو ان کی جان خطرے میں پڑتی ہے، کیونکہ نہ تو یہ لوگ ویل اکوپڈ ہیں، نہ ان کے پاس جو ہے وہ اس حوالے سے بوٹ اور دیگر جو آپ کو ساز و سامان چاہیے ہوتا ہے، یہ ان کے پاس نہیں ہے. تو اس کی وجہ سے ان لوگوں کے لیے بہت زیادہ سماجی اور ثقافتی مسائل بھی بڑھ گئے ہیں. اور اس کی وجہ سے وہاں پر ایک اور جو نیا ٹرینڈ شروع ہوا ہے وہ منشیات کا فروغ ہے. ٹھیک ہے، کیونکہ ظاہری بات ہے جب لوگوں کے پاس روزی روٹی ہی نہیں ہوگی اور ان کو بھی آلٹرنیٹیو بھی نہیں دیا جائے گا، تو اس طرح کا جو ایک اینٹائی سوشل ایک بیہیویئر ہے وہ لوگوں کے اندر آٹومیٹیکلی آ جاتا ہے، اور لوگ نقل مکانی کے لیے جو ہے وہ ہاتھ پاؤں مار رہے ہیں. اچھا، دوسرا اس کا جو بڑا امپیکٹ ہے وہ ہے مین گروو کے اوپر. مین گروو جو ہے وہ خود رو ایک جنگل ہے کافی بڑا سمندر کے اندر. تو یہاں کے جو مقامی لوگ تھے یہ وہاں سے جا کے جھینگے اور دوسری کئی سمندری حیات جو ہے وہ وہاں سے کاشت کرتے تھے اور پھر بیچتے تھے. اور اس مین گروو کی جو ہے وہ دیگر بھی بہت زیادہ خدمات تھیں. ٹھیک ہے، یہ سمندری طوفان کو بھی روکتا تھا اور کاربن سیکوسٹریشن جیسے کام بھی یہ کرتا تھا، اور ماحول کی صفائی وغیرہ یہ سارے جو ہے وہ اس کی خدمات میں آتی تھی. مگر اس ڈیولپمنٹ کا جو ایک وہاں پر ایک نیٹ ورک شروع ہوا ہے، تو اس کی وجہ سے اس جنگلات کی کٹائی جو ہے وہ بہت زیادہ اب سے نہیں کافی عرصے سے شروع ہے. اور جیسے جیسے پروجیکٹس بڑھ رہے ہیں ویسے ویسے یہ خود رو جنگل جو ہے وہ سکڑتا جا رہا ہے. تو اس کی وجہ سے وہاں کے مقامی لوگ بھی پریشان ہیں کہ اب اگر طوفان آتا ہے یا باقی چیزیں آتی ہیں تو یہ لوگ جو ہے وہ کیسے اپنے آپ کو پروٹیکٹ کریں گے. تو اور مسئلہ یہ بھی ہے کہ اس حوالے سے کچھ نہ کچھ اقدامات اٹھائے گئے ہیں، مگر وہ اقدامات بالکل ناکافی ہیں. صحیح طریقے سے کوانٹیفیکیشن نہیں ہوتی. مطلب اس حوالے سے جو EIAs وغیرہ کنڈکٹ کیے جاتے ہیں اس میں بھی تفصیل سے نہیں بتایا جاتا کہ کتنے ایک جو ہے وہ مین گروو کٹیں گے یا کتنے ایک لوگوں کی روزی روٹی متاثر ہوگی، اور یہ کہ ان لوگوں کو اور یہ کہ ان کو کیسے جو ہے وہ آلٹرنیٹیولی سپورٹ کیا جائے گا یا ریہیبلیٹیٹ کیا جائے گا. تو اس کے جو ہے وہ یہ چند مسائل ہیں جو کہ گیس کے حوالے سے ہمارے سماج، ہمارے ماحول اور ہمارے لیے جو ہے وہ اکانومی کے چند مسائل ہیں جو کہ پیدا ہو رہے ہیں. شکریہ.
شکریہ رافع. جیسے کہ رافع نے کہا اسی طرح ہمارے چیٹ میں بھی ایک جو ہے اسٹڈی ایک سٹوری جو ہے وہ پوسٹ کی گئی ہے، لنک اس کا، جو LNG ٹرمنل کے حوالے سے ایکویٹک لائف اور ہیومن کمیونٹیز پہ جو منفی اثرات مرتب ہو رہے ہیں اس کو بھی لوگ دیکھ سکتے ہیں. ہمارے پینلسٹ کا بہت شکریہ. ہم اب کوشچن آنسرز کی طرف چلتے ہیں. جن ساتھیوں کے پاس جو چاہتے ہیں وہ چیٹ باکس میں بھی لکھ سکتے ہیں یا ہینڈ ریز کا آپشن بھی استعمال کر سکتے ہیں زوم پہ. تو فلور از ناؤ اوپن. ایک سوال ہمارے چیٹ میں آیا ہوا ہے لوکل گیس ایکسپلوریشن کے حوالے سے، جو مس ہانیہ نے اس کا جواب بھی دیا ہے. میں رافع سے ریکویسٹ کروں گا کہ اگر اس پہ آپ کی بھی کوئی پرسپیکٹو ہے ماحولیات کے حوالے سے یا مقامی جو وہاں پہ لوگ ہیں، جو بستیاں ہیں اس وقت، اس کے حوالے سے. سوال یہ پوچھا گیا تھا کہ لوکل گیس کی ایکسپلوریشن کیوں نہیں کی جاتی اگر امپورٹس جو ہیں وہ مہنگے پڑ رہے ہیں.
اچھا، اس کا مختصراً جواب تو یہ ہے کہ ایک تو ہمارے ہاں کچھ سیکیورٹائزیشن کے کافی ایشو تھے، خاص طور پہ جب یہ افغانستان کے مسئلے مسائل شروع ہوئے تو کچھ جو فورن کمپنیز یا جو ہمارے لوکل کمپنیز تھیں اور اس کے لیے ایکسپلوریشن کی جو ایکسپیکٹڈ سائٹس تھیں وہاں پر سیکیورٹی کے کافی تھریٹس تھے. تو ایک تو اس وجہ سے وہاں پر نئی ایکسپلوریشن نہیں ہوئی. اور مطلب یہ ایک بڑا ایک جو ہے وہ ایشو ہے جو کہ سائٹ کیا جاتا ہے کہ کیوں جناب ہم لوکلی मजीद जो है वो न्यू वेल हेड्स एक्सप्लोर या डिस्कवर नहीं कर रहे।
एक और सवाल भी है, ये मुश्ताक की तरफ से क्वेश्चन है कि व्हाट आर द अल्टरनेटिव्स टू LNG एंड गैस? Fran, I'd request you to take that up.
Hi, thanks so much, Mushtaq, for that question. I think obviously LNG and gas are touted as a kind of quick fix to the energy problem. But in Pakistan in particular, there's a lot of potential for wind energy as well as solar, as well as biogas, which Hania was talking about earlier. So I think for Pakistan, there is so much potential from those sources of energy, and those can come on stream quite quickly, that it really is the potential for increasing energy security for Pakistan based on renewable energy is absolutely massive. I think that there is a real concern about the investment, not only by the World Bank, but other global investors in large hydro for Pakistan. And there's been a lot of pushback about that because on the one hand, water scarcity in the country creates large hydro creates further pressure on diminishing water sources, but also isn't reliable, because if there are significant droughts, then large hydro can be really problematic in the sense it doesn't produce enough energy. So I know that the Chinese have invested heavily in large hydro in Pakistan, but I really think there are such good alternatives in the sustainable renewable energy sphere that there should be more of an emphasis on wind and solar.
Ms. Maria Ismail, please go ahead.
आवाज आ रही है मेरी?
जी
जी बिल्कुल, जी बिल्कुल आ रही है।
बहुत सारी बातें सुनी है मैंने, बहुत अच्छा लगा है आपके ये बातें सुनकर, लेकिन मैं ये पूछना चाहती हूँ कि इन सब बातों का सलूशन क्या है असल में, कि हमें क्या करना चाहिए आखिर कि ये बातें हल हो सकें?
Shukriya, Maria. Fran, the question has been asked that a lot of things have been said, but what is the solution that lies ahead? Could you shed some light on it? So the problems have been explained well. Could you maybe summarize what you think the top lesson should be for the day?
Yes, sure. I mean, for me, I think that at least public finance should be ring-fenced to support a sustainable renewable energy transition. So obviously there's going to be private finance coming in to support different forms of energy, but public finance is quite limited, but it can really incentivize the private sector as well. So for me, public development banks ought to be putting 100% of their energy finance into supporting Pakistan to transition to a sustainable renewable future. And if they do that immediately, they can be Pakistan will have more energy security within 2 or 3 years. And so it just seems to me that's where the emphasis needs to be. And the stopping finance for things like importing LNG or the infrastructure around that would provide more finance for the renewable energy transition.
Thank you, Fran. There's another question for you from Mr. Khalik Siddiqui. Thank you. Question to Fran. Thank you for your presentation. Shifting to energy storage systems is a comparatively expensive solution added on top of the already intermittent ARE technologies. While there must be an aggressive shift to such technologies, what should be the intermediate move from gas LNG for base load purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very reasonable question, but I think, as I say, I think if there is significant investment in energy systems and in grid infrastructure and in battery storage, then to move the money out of fossil fuels and put it into that kind of thing would enable that transition to happen a lot more quickly. I'm not saying it can be immediate. Obviously, it's going to have to take a little bit of time to transition from one energy system to another. But I think that today there's been such a vast improvement in battery battery systems and their potential for storing energy that we're pretty much there now, and with the finance behind it, that could be a solution in the near future.
Thank you, Fran. Also for Khaliq Saab, I'm afraid, unfortunately, Hania had to leave early, but she also has some research on this question. So if you got in touch with her, she's posted her email in the chat box. She may also add to what Fran has stated. एक और question है chat box में. There's another question. Is in fertilizer sector where gas is used not only as a fuel but also as a raw material, what can be the alternatives to produce ammonia? Question is from Azal Ashari. Does anyone of our speakers want to take that up?
I'm not sure that I have the answer. I do realize that gas is really important for the fertilizer sector, and I'm guessing that renewable alternatives are available. But Zain, I don't know, maybe you have more information on this one.
Again, this is a good question, and it seems to be it will become a concern because the amount of gas reliance that fertilizer industry has. Azhar, I think the question could come from biofuel sources other than LNG and other than gas. And there is some research to support that as well. But we will share on the ACJCE website, we'll just put down in the chat box, we can share some links to new research on that front. So biofuel and especially those newer technologies of harnessing more organic matter seems to be a way forward. This is a partial answer from Mr. Shehram, which is that a lot of work is being done on green and blue ammonia. So that's another aspect in question there. Green ammonia, again, has been suggested as an alternative. We have another question from Sayyid Faisal Saab. A lot of capex investment has already been made in gas engines for power generation and for captive power plants. Do you think that a shift is possible while we are struggling for Forex, for foreign exchange? Fran, is this something you could take up?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really difficult balance. I mean, as I say, I think that I mean, what I'm interested in is getting public finance out of fossil fuels, because I think that that's going to incentivize a transition for the private sector out of fossil fuels as well. And so I'm not suggesting at this stage that, that's a wholesale move out of gas, although ultimately I think that's what I'd like to see. But there will be a process which has to be undergone to do that. So I think that first and foremost, if we can get public finance, because public finance is basically taxpayers' money, they are accountable. And so they should be thinking about the public good when they're allocating their funding. And the public good is the transition towards a sustainable, renewable future. At the same time, we recognize that there's private finance, which comes in as a separate strand, but public finance facilitates that and guarantees private finance. So I think by emphasizing the shift through public finance, we can see this move happen, but appreciate that the difficulty that Pakistan is having at the moment in terms of Forex, for sure. Yeah.
If I could also add to that, one of the problems with this, with this concern with costs is that capex investments absolutely would be high, and that's a concern. But the true cost of gas hasn't really been done. And this is true of the true cost of everything. कोयले के हिसाब की अगर बात की जाए, वो भी वहाँ भी यही मसला है. आरएफओ का हवाला दिया जाए तो वो भी यही मसला है. फॉसिल फ्यूल्स के साथ मसला ही असल में ये है कि हमने उसकी ट्रू कॉस्टिंग की नहीं है. जो उसकी इन्वायरमेंटल कॉस्ट्स हैं, उसके इन्वायरमेंटल डैमेज की या हेल्थ इफेक्ट्स हैं, उसके जो कॉस्ट हैं वो तो शामिल करते नहीं हम. अगर उन सारों को शामिल करके एक मतलब मजमूई तौर पे और उसका एक कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव तफसीली तौर पे उसका एक वो लिया जाए कि जायजा लिया जाए कि असल में इसकी क्या पब्लिक को क्या इसका खर्चा भरना पड़ता है लॉन्ग रन में, तो फिर हमें शायद ये मालूम पड़े कि वो केपेक्स कॉस्ट के ज़्यादा होने के बावजूद ये हमारे लिए एक सही डायरेक्शन नहीं है या सही फैसला नहीं है. ये भी एक पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है, और हमारे इस वक्त जो सिस्टम है प्लानिंग का उसमें अच्छी खासी चेंज की ज़रूरत है ताकि एनवायरमेंटल कॉस्टिंग को भी फैक्टर किया जाए. तो जस्ट अ पर्सपेक्टिव टू ऐड टू व्हाट फ्रान हैज सेड. हमारे किसी और साथी का कोई सवाल है? मेरे ख्याल से हम इसके साथ इख्तिताम की तरफ आते हैं. तमाम साथियों का बहुत शुक्रिया आपकी शिरकत की. हमारे जितनी भी यहाँ पे स्टडीज़ का हवाला दिया गया है वो मटेरियल अवेलेबल हैं. चैट बॉक्स में आपको उनके लिंक्स दिए गए हैं. जो सवाल जिनका जवाब नहीं दिया जा सका, ईमेल्स भी मौजूद हैं, उनमें आप ईमेल अपनी क्वेरी कर सकते हैं. We will get back to you as soon as possible. और इसी के साथ फिर मैं अपने पैनलिस्ट का भी शुक्रिया करता हूँ, और इंशाल्लाह इस इशू पे जो है वो मज़ीद काम हमारा रहेगा. शुक्रिया आप सारे साथियों का. Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Rafe. We have brought our program to an end now.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I've also learnt a lot from listening to Hania, and I've read also a lot about Rafi. So although I don't speak Urdu, I have followed very closely the work that he's doing, and I really appreciate that as well. And good luck to everybody working for this important transition.
Great. Assalamu alaikum. Bye bye.